So radical theology in spiritual community, in my opinion, has to always lead to social and political action, period. So radical theology to me is a parasite. It's inherently parasitic. It has to essentially feed on confessional theology structures. Okay, so this idea that radical theology is atheism is antithetical, I think, to its very nature. The term is radical theology. In other words, theology is a part of it. So for me, it's inherently deconstructive. It is that which haunts. It is about exposing that which haunts, the ghosts that haunt our confessional structures, our faith, if you want to call it that, or at least our hope that there is a God, or hope that there is something beyond. It is about exposing the doubts that haunt any hopes, that haunt any faith that we have, with the unanswerable questions, with the inexplicable mysteries of suffering and the human experience. Radical theology is, in a way, not just what feeds on confessional or haunts. It is that which exposes what's already haunting our confessional theologies. As Caputo would put it, the fetishes, it exposes how our theology often functions as a fetish, right? That which are these idolatrous ideas that we need in place in order to have catharsis, to experience some kind of relief.
You brought up idolatry there at the end there, and you also were talking about how it's a radical theology is a type of theology. So I want to ask this question: how do we kind of, from your perspective, construct a theology that is not idolatrous?
Right.
What is our image of God or of the beyond, of the divine, or within radical theological framework that can be not kind of distilled down to an idolatrous reification of these fetishes,
right?
But something that actually inspires hope, but also is not, again, idolatrous.
Idolatry has to do with certainty, in my opinion. So the only way to construct a theology that's not idolatrous is to expose it to infinite uncertainty, to expose it to these atheistic steps, you could say. In other words, to take your theology all the way as close to atheism as possible, actually make it kind of blurred with atheism. That's the only way to keep it from being idolatrous. And that's really, really hard to do for a lot of people, to really go through these atheistic steps.
Couldn't atheism also be a form of idolatry?
Absolutely, yeah. The new atheism, which isn't new at all. It's basically 19th century reductionism and materialism. And so new atheism, the kind of Richard Dawkins, the late Chris Hitchens, Sam Harris, they enter into their atheism with the same kind of certitude and dogmaticism as any religious fundamentalist, because I think it functions as a coping mechanism for them. It gives them a sense of security. It gives them a sense of knowing. It gives them a sense of profound supremacy in thought, that they've got the answers and you don't. And they derive, I think, an enormous amount of satisfaction on that. And there's, I think, even a kind of meaning they get from that. As I love that joke that Pete tells about the three priests in church. I don't know if you've heard this one before, but I'll tell it in case your audience hasn't heard it. So there's three priests praying in a church, and the first priest bows and prays, "I am dust, I am nothing." The second priest bows and prays, "I am dust, I am nothing." Finally, the third priest bows and prays, "I am dust, I am nothing." And while this is taking place, the janitor's in the back of the sanctuary cleaning, and he puts down his supplies and comes forward and kneels down next to the three priests at the altar, and he too prays, "I am dust, I am nothing." To which the three priests are kind of shocked, and they open their eyes and look over and see him and look at each other and say, "Who does this guy think he is, saying that he's dust and he's nothing?" So there's this idea that even a great negation of meaning can be a way of finding meaning, right? Even a negation of God. Any kind of, whatever, religious structure, belief structure can be a way of giving ourselves catharsis. So yeah, that's how atheism can be a kind of idolatrous engagement.
Yeah, I was just looking at it in terms of certainty, because if you can make the absolute claim that there is no God, or there is no beyond, there is no divine, and all the kind of claims that come with it, it's that certainty that can then become condescending when you start looking at the world around you. Like in the story of the three priests, they're very condescending. They seem to have the truth, even though they seem to be humble at the same time, humbling themselves before the altar. But at the same time, they're also condescending to anybody else who doesn't fit within their framework of who should be allowed at the altar and who should be able to be speaking these truths. So I guess I was just focusing on the certainty there that like atheism and new atheism can create that kind of parallels that kind of dogmatic theism too, where we think we have all the pictures of God perfectly defined, and therefore we just need to apply that macrocosmic picture or worldview to the world itself around us, and then we can kind of like chart this world order and this course, you know.
And so in that way, radical theology has something even to say to atheists. I mean, it does. That's part of what makes it so radical.
Yeah, it opens the door to uncertainty, which allows in a lot of different discourses and conversations about what it is we actually hope for, what it is we actually are thinking about, what it is we're praying about as people who may or may not believe in God. And
I think radical theology ultimately should lead everyone to say, for example, it should lead the Christian to say, I rightly pass as a Christian, instead of saying that I am a Christian. It should rightly lead the atheist to say, I rightly pass as an atheist, but I'm not, as Derrida would say, I won't actually say that I am an atheist because I'm not the only one that's speaking. I don't know who I am. I don't know what, as Rollins would say, I believe I don't know what I believe. Mm-hmm. That there is this radical theology as part of this postmodern philosophical movement is part of this deeper recognition that we don't know who's speaking when we speak. We don't even know ourselves. And belief functions on the unconscious, right? Mm-hmm. It comes out of the unconscious. Belief is so often the stories, whether it's belief or unbelief, are often just the stories we like to tell ourselves about ourselves in order to give ourselves some kind of catharsis, some kind of relief in the world, because existence is extremely painful, right? Yeah. So the atheist should be informed by radical theology to say, I rightly pass for an atheist, but I don't know what I mean by that, if I'm really honest. And maybe I'm not an atheist all the time. maybe I don't believe in nothing. Maybe I believe in something, and I just don't know what it is. And rightly, the Christian or the theist needs to allow radical theology to spook them enough to say, maybe I'm not a Christian. Maybe I don't believe in God. Maybe I don't know what I'm talking about when I speak of God. And maybe that's the deepest affirmation of God, right? There you go. There's a deeper affirmation of faith in place, right? Maybe we speak of God. We are speaking of that which we don't know. And the only way to really speak of God in the what's the apophatic tradition is to speak in negation in order to really speak of the depths of God, right? Mm-hmm. To really give God her place, its place rightfully in the world as the ineffable, as the unconditional. And for me, that's what radical theology is a tool. It is a technology that helps me plumb the depths. It is not the depths itself. It is simply a technology that helps me plumb the depths. And for me, being a pastor of a radical theology community, I want to lead other people on a tour of the depths, you could say. I'm leading a journey into the cave of unknowing. We are splunking, into the cave of unknowing and on an exciting journey into the infinite depths of the human experience. That sounds really arrogant, I guess, but I don't know. I really do see it that way, and I hope that my congregation feels that we are on this incredible, exciting journey together, and we don't know where it's going to end up. And some of us leave that journey halfway into it, or we say, you know what, the journey's taking me outside of your church. I'm done with God. I'm done with Christianity. I'm going somewhere else with this. And I say, farewell. That's what radical theology means to me. That's what it means to me as a pastor right now.
So it's interesting because I've listened to some of your podcasts over the last couple of weeks, and it seems to me within your community that there's a spectrum within your church of people who rightly pass as atheists and people who rightly pass as theists, and anywhere in between where people are not sure what they pass as.
Yes.
And I think that is important because I see radical theology, especially from Peter Rollins' perspective, and a lot of this is because he's drawing upon psychoanalytic theory through Zizek and Lacan, but as being therapeutic in a lot of ways.
Yes.
Theotherapeutic for a lot of people, because I think that a radical theological community must be embraced and engaged within the mystery, within the depths, within these kind of you might say, catacombs, so to
Yeah.
speak, right? Going into the deeper places that are darker and mysterious, but with some sort of guide. Because I think for a lot of us who left certainty, who left theological communions, where it was just kind of cookie cutter and you just had to find your place within it and everything was already figured out for you, the mystery was gone. There was no more mystery. It was already figured out. You just have to kind of plug into the Borg and you'll be good. But
The Borg.
maybe you can touch on that a little bit. Like, what is your methodology? How do you do pastoral kind of counseling, if you do that, or conversations or whatever, for people who are exploring the depths, who might be a little bit afraid to do it, especially at first, or people who are more experienced?
Thank you. I'm still figuring that out. I'm listening to your question and I'm feeling kind of dread in trying to answer it because I'm still figuring that out, Preston. I feel like what I'm attempting to do weekly in preparing my Sunday talk is as a pastor, I have that deep heart for therapy, in the sense that I want to help people make peace with the truth of their lives. I want to help people make peace with the awful truth, really, in some ways, and with their doubts, with their fears about a knowing in God. And Central, which is the name of my church, Central Avenue Church, it is a community mostly made up of people suffering from religious trauma, mostly recovering from spiritual trauma, and wondering what, if anything, Christianity or God means in their life now. That is a place of radical honesty, but real brokenness and fear about what comes next. And I'm simply trying to help people work through that in a way that's responsible and hopefully healing. I really do believe that Christianity, the Christian message, that approaching faith can be done in a very healthy and life-giving way. I am convinced of that. I am fully convinced of that. I am convinced that spiritual community, meaning church, can still be meaningful for some people and something that the world still needs. Maybe I'm saying that because I have a vested interest. This is how I make my living. But I hope it's not just out of that bias that I'm saying that. I hope that I really do believe that, even if I wasn't a pastor. But it's not just me that believes it. It's my board. It's my community that believes that. So the way that I approach this on a week in, week out basis is, how do I lead people down this path, is I really just try to construct talks that simultaneously critique and deconstruct something about faith and spirituality, and then simultaneously affirm something about it. Does that make sense? So I'm trying every week not just to deconstruct or critique something and tear something down to expose a ghost, but to affirm something about faith and spirit, about Christianity, about faith and spirituality, about Christ himself, really, even, without getting idolatrous, which is always the trick, right? Mm-hmm. But I'm not always concerned about whether or not people are being idolatrous. Because in a way, I look at this as recovery. People that are addicted to drugs and alcohol, let's say, we're all addicted. If we're in the church, we're addicted, and we're gonna make mistakes, and we're gonna go back and relapse, and we're gonna get high again, we're gonna get drunk again. And the idea isn't to shake our finger at each other and be like, "Oh, how dare you go back and be idolatrous again with God? You bad person, you," or something. I look at it like that. I'm okay with a little bit of I don't want to say abuse, but a little bit of drug use again. I'm okay with people getting high again. I do too. And it's not, I guess I don't get too worked up on it, but I am running a recovery outfit. I am. And does that make sense? I'm constantly trying to balance the critique with an affirmation. That's really what I want to.
I think it's important, because I think even Paul in some of his letters would say, like, put off the old world, or whatever, the old Adam, if you want to put it in terms, and put on the new Adam, which is Christ, right? So it's always that deconstruction kind of, and the affirmation of something new, because I think it's easy for people to get lost in deconstruction when you're taking apart things and kind of just feel lost, like you don't have an identity any longer. Yes. And then if you don't have something to kind of latch onto to kind of reconstruct or reform, like, your personal identity, or like how you see God, or how you see your faith community, then maybe you just become somebody who just is lost in the void.
And I want to respond to that, because this is one of my biggest critiques of radical theology and radical theologians the theorists more than the practitioners. I'm a practitioner, and I love the theorists, don't get me wrong, but sometimes the theorists can sound, and I use the analogy of the parent of the cynical parent of a teenager who's fallen in love for the first time, right? So the theorists can basically tell us, look, it's great that you're in love with life, be in love, right? But just don't fall in love too much. Don't get carried away because you'll look foolish. I feel like radical theologians can be like that and saying to us, don't fall in love with life so much. Don't get so overwhelmed with your awe and wonder for life and being that you reaffirm a theism, that you reaffirm something transcendent and metaphysical or something theological. Be like us, where we're basically new atheists. You know what I mean? Where I feel like that's sort of the subtext of a lot of radical theologians, where it's just kind of like, love life, love others, lose yourself a little bit beyond wonder, just not so much that you affirm anything transcendent or metaphysical about it anymore. And for me, I'm kind of like, no. I think if you're really, really lost in your love for life and the sense of awe and wonder, that you can't help but at least suspect, I'm not saying believe in God, but you can't help but suspect that there's something transcendent going on. I think if you're really, really lost in the love itself, if you're really, really given over to the awe and wonder, you can't help but at least suspect, again, not saying believe, but suspect or have an inkling or maybe even a hope, I don't know, that there's something else going on. Again, this isn't about theism. This isn't about reaffirming some kind of onto-theology, to put it in Heidegger. But it is about being open to the perhaps, as Caputo would put it, or the possibility of the impossible, being open to the transcendent. And I think I'm going out on a limb to say perhaps one has to at least be an agnostic to really affirm life in its depths. And that kind of agnosticism is at least an openness to the metaphysical and the transcendent, without making any kind of deep confessional theology, any kind of strong theology. One lives in weak theology still, but that's where I'm at with it, Preston. I'm a little critical these days of this kind of crypto new atheism that can come packaged with radical theology.
I think that's prescient, because I think that for me, I still uphold a kind of a mystery or even a post-theistic kind of theism of sorts, right? I think the term post-theism is helpful because it's kind of like post-classical theism, the God of ontology, the omni-God or whatever, that I think a lot of people have really struggled with, but it also opens the door for other versions of the divine, of transcendence, of mystery of God. And I think that radical theology for me has really worked towards that goal in a lot of ways, because I think that I think it helped me debunk or kind of critique or loosen the constraints of confessional theology for me, and I think that's been helpful. But I don't think I pass as an atheist, to be honest with you. I don't think
I do, but it depends on who I'm talking to, because if I go back and talk to my old evangelical friends, they've actually told me, I think you're an atheist and you just need to own it. And I'm like, well, I take that as a compliment, actually. But I'm not going to own it because, but I'm also not going to own that I'm a theist anymore either. Because I'm not a classical theist. In fact, I will say even on Sunday mornings that I am an atheist with regards to the God that I used to believe in, and that supreme being God in the sky. I am an atheist. The God who's up there judging the living and the dead and deciding which child to heal of cancer and which not to. The God with the hell to throw people into. I am an atheist with regards to that God. And for me, that's the God being critiqued most often by Richard Dawkins and Chris Hitchens, and rightfully so. Right. As Caputo says, you get the atheism you deserve. You get the atheism you deserve. So radical theology in spiritual community, in my opinion, has to always lead to social and political action, period. Mm-hmm. If radical theology is not taking a spiritual community towards embodying it in political and social activism, then I don't think we're actually, allowing radical theology to really inform us to the degree that we need to be. For me, that's the end goal of radical theology. It is a kind of, I don't know if incarnational is the right word. That's a theological term, so maybe it is. This idea that we become the hands and feet of God in the world, that God does not exist, right? God insists, as Caputo would say. To me, that means that we are to become political and social activists in the world. This is what it means to be Christ in the world. This is what it means to be a Christian, is to defend the most vulnerable and the poor, to stand up for them, and to critique systems of power, theological or political, and political is theological quite often. So, I mean, for me today, and at church, even yesterday was Sunday, I'm up there denouncing Trump as demonic. I'm using terms like demonic and demonic possession to talk about the hidden racism and nationalism and xenophobia and bigotry that possesses evangelicalism today. And I think using the words like demonic and demonic possession is entirely appropriate, and even a great language, I think, to use to describe what we're seeing today. So for me, the radical theology in lived community means political and social activism, and critiquing all kinds of systems of power in the practical material world. So yes, we are a church that is very much looking and going on marches, looking for political activism, more than marches, but that is a way that we function. We're in Los Angeles too, which probably is important to mention, where it's extremely left and there's marches to participate in.
Right, and marches are very public in terms of they're very much a media spectacle in a lot of ways. They're ways to kind of bring a lot of people together who wouldn't necessarily come together in any other event.
Yeah.
As a Christian community, you're probably coming together in marches with people who are atheist, agnostic, different religions, right?
Right.
People don't know where they are in the spectrum of belief or not belief or whatever. So it's a way to kind of build community in a broader sense. Because I mean, as human beings, we also live and breathe and exist in those communities outside of the four church walls as well.
Yeah.
I mean, some people might be able to shut themselves off from the rest of the world and just exist within a Christian community in terms of this is all I am, this is all I'm going to talk about, and so on. But I think for most of us, we exist in a very, especially in Los Angeles, a very plural world.
Yeah.
And so for me, I think that building those connections within a community and outside of the spiritual community is important, because I think for me, it's a replication of the world itself. And like you're saying, it's an embodied theology. So you can minister and nurture to those around you, and also have them minister and nurture to you in terms of your blind spots. I know Peter Rollins has he used to have this thing called the Evangelism Project, where, he would take his community to other communities, not to teach them about their faith, but to actually learn from the other people about their faith and how they are seen in their light. And I think that's a really cool idea. If we do that just in conversations with people, I mean, that just happens, right?
That's where it mostly happens. Marches is one thing, but most of the actual differences I think we're making politically and socially are made in relationships with those people in our life. And that happens a lot on social media. As much as I hate Facebook, I also see it as a technology that really exposes people to ideas they wouldn't encounter otherwise. It really is that marketplace of ideas, for better or for worse.
Well, that's what the internet itself does. I mean, Facebook is a really good vehicle for that, but also the internet itself has brought together a bunch of communities around the world, people around the world. And there are people arguing that a lot of the rise of the nuns, NONES nuns in the United States and around the world, I think, are driven by access to information that they didn't have before. So they're no longer sequestered into their communities, and knowledge is no longer held away from them.
Yeah, but as much as that's happening, the opposite's happening too, where because of the enormous exposure to different and scary ideas, people are also, as a reaction, the unhealthy folks are withdrawing more and more into their tribes and turning away from and getting more and more tribal and not wanting to engage with the other and seeing the other as the ultimate enemy to be defeated, right? And as much as that's happening for some, I would say the inability for a lot of people to reconcile really different ideas into their social body is driving them more into their tribes. And in a way, Trumpism is a reaction against globalization and you know what I mean. So I I think that's happening too.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think that some people are withdrawing more from the world and new ideas and new ways of seeing the world and transformation than, say, other people are?
Well, I think honestly, like, I think radical theology speaks to this as a kind of, as you put it, theotherapeutic, idea that we all hunger for, certainty and security, and to feel like, our handle on the world's the right one. And when we are confronted with the fact that we are immersed in, inexplicable unknowing and mystery and difficulty, that's terrifying. And so we want to find some kind of mooring and some new set of answers. And so I think some people, when, we encounter them, the modern world and different ideas, and, we are entering into this global space, it's terrifying. I think for all of us, as Tad DeLay points out in, I think God is Unconscious, his first book, that if youth claim that different ideas and different people don't scare you, you're either lying or you have a malfunctioning brain, because we evolved to be scared of the unknown. We evolved to be scared of different people and different ideas, because these things are, for survival techniques, different ideas and different people can be life-threatening. So I think, the deeper psychological reasons for fundamentalism or for withdrawal into tribalism is just that. I think it's the way we evolved, and we have to understand that about ourselves in order to break free from that, I think, first of all. But man, I think we're going to continue to see. I don't know where it's all going. People ask me all the time, where's all this heading? All this tribalism, this resurgence of fascism that we're seeing today, both in and outside the church. I don't know, and it's scary, because human beings are capable of basically just shutting their brain off and withdrawing into these kind of dark ages. Really, right? We could see kind of a kind of dystopic future where people withdrawn, in kind of a new dark age, because as we learn more and more about ourselves, the world, and the universe, I think it's getting damn scary. I don't know if our brains are advanced enough to really reconcile these enormous challenges. When we come to terms with cosmic annihilation, the fact that we now know for the first time in human history, just over the last 70 years, that the universe is, basically going dark, and there is. I mean, I know that sounds really out there, but I think that on the macro level is reflected in the micro, that we are coming to terms today as never before as a species, especially in the modern West, with these really, really unreconcilable ideas. And I don't know, I'm trying to put it to words, but it's really scary. I think it's really scary today.
Yeah, I think you're right that we don't have the capacity as a species to really deal with the kind of impending nihilism.
Yes, that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, because I think that, you brought it up with annihilation and with cosmic annihilation, because not only is our universe going to eventually have no more energy that's usable, therefore, like you said, it's going to go dark and cold. Also, we're faced with a planet that may not be able to sustain our type of living. Not just our type of living in terms of modern Western consumerism and capitalism, but just in terms of our species. Within the next couple centuries, maybe there's going to be no longer human life on this planet, right?
Right.
And so that's another dread. And so I guess coupling those ideas with the idea of political or religious fragmentation or diversity, when you're coming from like a quote unquote Christian West and you really identify with the Christian and Western kind of notion of who you are, to see like not only the cosmic aspects and the planetary aspects, but the kind of the cultural identitarian aspects being kind of challenged, that makes sense to me, that people would want to, instead of just embrace the diversity and this kind of fragmentation and destruction of that worldview in a lot of ways, but would actually kind of dig deeper down into it and double down on it, even though there are implications for themselves and for the rest of the people that they're actually hurting, right?
Right. I tend to be optimistic. I'm an optimistic personality by nature. But the more I see what's going on and the older I get, I'm 42 now, the less optimistic I am about human nature. We are still that reptile brain. We are capable of turning our back on the truth and practicing immense amounts of denial and ignorance. And I am really concerned that I don't know if the future's bright. I don't. I kind of wonder if we're going to revert back to a kind of dark ages or something. I don't know.
It's funny because like there were a lot of Christian fundamentalists in homeschooling movement who would talk about how the culture is reverting back to the Dark Ages, so we need to learn Latin and Greek and do this classical Christian kind of schooling. But now we're hearing it from like more progressive wings of the church, or more progressive wings of just political thinking, that we might be actually going back to a literal Dark Ages where technology is like, we have the knowledge for technology, but maybe we don't have the means for it anymore. Or
And so I guess in that way, we're kind of agreeing with the fundamentalists, this kind of Calvinist idea that man is so depraved, right? And we need a savior because we have no hope. There's this inherent nihilism to fundamentalism that kind of is true. I mean, they take it seriously, and the progressives are the ones who are kind of ignorantly optimistic about human nature, that people are inherently good and we can trust ourselves. And there's that view of, Star Trek. If you ever watch Star Trek, as you do, because you mentioned the Borg, it's this incredibly optimistic view of humanity that, in the 24th century, everything's going to be great. There's not going to be, any more racism, and we're not going to need money, and we're going to be exploring the galaxy. And it's kind of like, no, bullshit. we're horrible. That's not the future. I don't know. I laugh, but it's profoundly sad, Preston. I guess I don't know if I'm an optimist anymore.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, because I think that I think the idea of sin, not in it's like the way original sin gets kind of touted out as like you need a savior and Jesus died for you and all that evangelism stuff, but I think just the idea of like an inherited kind of brokenness, that not that we inherit as beings coming into the world, but that we inherit as in our materiality or our spirituality, but that we are born into a world that's already broken.
Yes.
Right. And that's how I interpret sin and the mythology of the garden and all that stuff.
Me too.
Not that there's necessarily like a literal historical Adam and Eve, or even a group of people who, but I interpret it as like a rebellion against God spiritually that had like real communal and material consequences, not death and disease and all that stuff that existed for forever. But this idea that like spiritually we are broken and malformed because we're not in line with what is actually good for us. If you want to define that as God or whatever, that's fine. And so for me, like I think sin is actually a really helpful notion that we should actually keep, but within radical theology, of course, deconstructing it, making sense of it, and kind of applying it in a different way. But I think that getting rid of it, and which I think a lot of optimistic progressive theology does, because and that's, for me, it connects to like this idea, like you said, as you're getting older, you're becoming more or less and less an optimist. And I think I'm feeling that too as a 35-year-old, because I feel like when I was younger, I reasoned like a young kid. I thought of this progressive narrative in America, like after the war, things just got better, but now it seems like things are getting darker. So.
Yeah, the older it's like Ecclesiastes, right? To increase knowledge is to increase sorrow. The more that you know, the more sorrowful you become, because you realize what the world is really, really like. And
stay pretty and die young.
Yeah, right. So don't get me wrong, I have hope. I haven't lost my hope. But I've lost my naive optimism. I've lost my naive optimism.
So how could we, as radical theologians, especially and like you as a practitioner of radical theology, help bridge the gap in the sense, or open up a space for the kind of identities and the people who really double down on fundamentalism or evangelicalism in the conservative aspect? Like, how have you thought about that, or even approached that?
Well, for those who have doubled down and are really, strident, or and on their fundamentalism and conservatism, they're not going to be interested in a radical theology community. So it's not something you can really create for them. You can only create a radical theology for community for those who are open to being spooked.
Well, yeah, no, and I get that. I meant like nonsense, like convert them or bring them over to the community, but like, how do we create a narrative whereby they no longer feel threatened by the world of diversity, right? Where they don't have to feel like they have to double down on their Western Christian identity or support Trumps and McConnell's and those kind of agendas, but can still have their kind of like their understanding of what reality is. So I feel like a lot of this it is brought upon by economics and globalization and migrations and stuff like that, but and that fear that gets stoked with that. I'm just wondering, like, how do we?
Yeah.
Let me speak to that.
Let me speak to that. I don't think the answer is theological argumentation with them. It's not. The answer, if there is one, and it's very hard to do, is they have to be confronted with the moral and political implications of their beliefs and values. In other words, you have to appeal to their base humanity, their empathy. And a lot of people are incapable not a lot of people, but maybe a lot, are incapable of empathy. I mean, but when people really are confronted with the evil of their beliefs and how they're really hurting people, that's when I think they're most open to changing their beliefs. It's like, I think Tad DeLay talks about how people change what they believe when they desire to change. It doesn't happen when they're convinced that they're wrong. It doesn't happen when they're shown in the Bible how their theology is out of whack. People change their beliefs when they desire to change. And what often brings that desire is a confrontation with their own, their own evil, the fact that, their lack of empathy for others, and their murderous and violent and oppressive political and religious beliefs. Until people are really confronted with that, I don't think they're going to change. In other words, the answer isn't to argue with the theological conservative about theology. The answer is to argue on moral and political grounds and really show them who they're harming, and hope that empathy will win the day.
Besides voting and putting in a new Congress and putting in a new president in 2020, like, how do we deal with the deep divides again within our political community that stem from a lot of theological baggage? Right? Like, how do we make this world better when there is a large group of people in this world who, for whatever reason, seem hell-bent on making it worse?
Wow, yeah, isn't that the question? It happens on so many different levels, and you're right, it's not just voting and voting in the right politicians, because perfectly frank, I'm done with the bipartisan strife. I think there's so many cynics. I've lost trust in that. Nevertheless, it's a necessary evil you got to participate in it, I guess, to make some kind of difference. But, I think you're right. Somebody said recently in the Q&A at my church, it was, in fact, I know who it was, a guy named JP. He actually grew up partly in I think it was Liberia, in really, really oppressive political regime, and where civil war was taking place. And he noticed growing up and spending time in that environment that what really made the difference in the culture was the one-on-one relationships. In other words, you really invest yourself in speaking with the people and caring for the people in your life. And especially, he was talking about how people with very different political and religious viewpoints coming together and understanding each other better as a result of genuine human care and concern. So his point was, we think too much in the macro. How can we change the culture on a grand scale? How can we confront these systems of injustice on a grand scale? When really, if we just deal with the personal relationships we have with people we find difficult, and I'm thinking specifically like about my brother and my family right now, on my attempt to really bridge the gaps between me and them, or them and I right now, that's a point of focus. And I think if everybody really focused on ways that they can handle their personal relationships better and try to bridge those gaps, I think that would make a big difference, Preston. I do. But again, that takes a lot of careful thought. And
right.
And in a way, it's almost easier to just think about, making a difference on this macro political scale, and just think about, how we're going to make a difference is by voting and doing marches. And I don't have to worry about, talking to my family anymore and those friends I used to have growing up. And I'm not, I think it's easier in a way. It's kind of like maybe allegorical to that fundamentalist belief that set your eyes on heaven because the world is broken and there's nothing you can do about it. So just hang out in your church and wait for Christ to come back and, go to heaven when you die, and just, deal with your own personal inner life, and that's it. And because it's really hard to actually deal with the micro and our personal relationships. When I think ultimately the answers lie there.
Yeah, I think it's difficult for us because I think those relationships and one-on-one moments kind of confront us with our finitudes and our inability to
Yeah.
maybe feel like we're potent enough to kind of like actually do the change even on a one-on-one level.
Right.
Because I know from my experience, when I converse with people who I disagree with, a lot of times I'm the one who's changed in a lot of ways, right?
Yeah.
So I have to admit, I confess in a way that like I was inadequate, and maybe they showed me, and then maybe I can learn something from this person who I radically disagree with on a lot of things, right? I think conversations are dangerous, and because they're dangerous, that's why they're difficult, because they can lead in any number of directions, especially when you're trying to converse, like in your case with your brother, or me with some old Calvinist friends, which they've kind of all unfriended me, and
Yeah.
I unfriended them a bunch of times too. But especially at the beginning. But this idea, like you're at theological odds, and therefore you cannot no longer be friends, is something that's like. I mean, I guess I understand from maybe a more conservative perspective when you think somebody is not only going to hell, but like their beliefs and teachings might influence other people in the church or your kids or whatever, and so lead them down the same path. We're false prophets, kind of thing.
Right.
We need to be taken out and stoned, basically, to death.
Right.
Even if that's like just lobbing Facebook posts and stuff like that to you or whatever, or
Yeah.
defriending you. But I mean, how do you deal with like somebody who believes your theology is actually leading people to hell? Like, how does that? You know what I mean? Like,
There's nothing you can do about that. There's
yeah.
nothing. I'm convinced, again, no theological argument's going to convince them otherwise. They have to go through something personal. They have to be confronted with their own lack of empathy, the moral and political implications of their beliefs. They have to come to terms with and acknowledge their own inner anxieties and doubts that they're in denial about. Those things have to happen first, and I can't lead them into that. I basically, when someone says stuff like that to me online or something like that, I actually don't respond with, hey, fuck you back or something like that, because I think that's counterproductive. I think the key is to say, listen, I understand where you're coming from. I'm sorry you feel that way. And show them some level of kindness, just, in my opinion. Again, I'm a pastor, so I'm going to be pastoral. But that comes from a genuine place where I really am convinced that, if we're just going around telling everybody we disagree with, even if their beliefs are really violent, fuck you. I think, that's a problem, but I think there's a way of telling them, I think your beliefs are racist. I think your beliefs are bigoted. I think there's a way of saying that with while still acknowledging their humanity and their capability of changing. I do. I think there's a way of doing that. Unfortunately, I think a lot of people on the left, especially a lot of post-evangelicals who harbor a lot of hurt, and rightfully so, tend to turn around and say to those in their past, fuck you. And they burn those bridges when they don't have to. Let the conservatives burn the bridge. Don't you burn the bridge. I really try to teach people that, you can tell them that they're being racist. You can tell them that they're being homophobic. You can call us a spade, and we need to be brutally honest. I'm not saying we shouldn't be honest, but there's a way of handling that without being vindictive. Does that make sense? Without being, kind of the very thing that we're preaching against in a way.
Right.
We're preaching against this kind of fundamentalist, vindictive, angry, violent, oppressive, nature. And meanwhile, we can kind of embody that with this kind of new belief system or radical theology. And that's not the way forward. The way forward is to be honest, speak the truth in love. Sorry, folks, I said it. Speak the truth in love. I think
this is where your optimism is starting to seep through.
Yeah. But again, I see people change. I change. Yeah. You change. And to be perfectly frank, we changed because there were people. To be honest, there were people along the way who said things into my life in a way that worked for me. But mostly I changed because I was confronted with the oppressive nature of my own beliefs,
right,
and the lack of empathy I had. I was really confronted with that. But
so let's turn the conversation and kind of wrap up on a more upbeat note, I guess. What brings you joy about being a pastor in your community?
It's a great question. What brings me joy is to see on really a weekly basis people, and be told on a weekly basis from people like, this is really making a difference for me. This is really helping me. This community is really making a difference. If I didn't feel like this was working for anybody, I couldn't keep it up. I'd be too depressed. I'd be too discouraged. But week in and week out, I find so much joy in that. Yeah.
So it's a transformation of people's lives.
Yeah.
Sounds very pastoral of you.
The hope. No, it is. And I'm fed by that. A lot of I think pastors are burnt out when they are really confronted with the fact that they're not making a difference, or they're reinforcing something that is unhealthy. They no longer believe what they used to, and they have to keep up a charade. That's where burnout comes from.
So you enjoy the honesty? I mean, because it sounds like in your position in the community, there's a great place for you and a space for you to be honest about everything. I mean, literally honest. Not that you don't have to hide anything. I mean, you mentioned like when you first started working there were some things maybe when you were more shepherded by the board or whatever you couldn't say, but now you feel like you can actually be honest with people.
Yeah, so there was an evolution. The history of this church was Southern Baptist. I was hired when it basically was dying, and they wanted to change everything and cut the ties with the Southern Baptists. And so I was hired as a non-denominational guy to come in and help them through that transformation. But I didn't get into radical theology until I didn't even know what it was till about 2013. And when I first read Peter Rollins' The Idolatry of God, it was like a bomb went off in my life. And that's when I really started changing as a pastor and got more honest. And yeah.
But you feel like even today, like the Sunday, if you have a doubt about something, you can bring it up in the church. And
oh, absolutely. I've come out and said multiple times, to some people's chagrin, I no longer believe in the bodily resurrection of Jesus. For me, right. It's definitely spiritualized. And I've said that multiple times. I've been very honest about the fact that I no longer believe in a supreme being, that I'm more like Tillich in the sense of, for me, God, if there is a God, is this grounded being, right? Yeah, I've been very honest about all that. And to some people, that's been a big turnoff. I've lost people. People have left the church because they feel like what's implied is and this isn't true, but they believe that I'm saying that if you believe in the resurrection, the physical resurrection of Jesus, you're kind of naive and stupid. I have never said that, and I will never say that. But this is where I'm at. And, if it's really a radical community, man, you've got to be able to have people with very different theological beliefs and metaphysics at play, and to allow those to be embraced. I embrace some very classic, theology and metaphysics. For me, I like what Catherine Sarah Moody says. Not all gods need to die, just the murderous and oppressive ones.
Right.
And so even a strong theology, a God of strong theology, can be held as long as it's not murderous and oppressive.
Liberation theology, man.
Yes, yeah. And in fact, radical theology, in my opinion, is a liberation theology. It really is a liberation. It is political. It is absolutely a liberation theology.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm really thankful we were able to get on and have this conversation.
Thank you so much. I still appreciate these opportunities to do podcasts, and thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's really fun. It was good having you on.
All right, Preston.
All right, man. We'll see you later.
Later.